Hello, friends, and welcome back to our study of Scripture and of the Exodus. Well, today we're going to be wandering through the wilderness with the ancient Israelites on a journey to the Promised Land, studying the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy. But before we begin, let us pray and let us say together again the ancient prayer of the Shema. Ancient, but also modern, because as we said last time, the Jews still pray this prayer 3 times a day in their synagogues. Let us place ourselves in the presence of God. Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, bechol levavcha, uvechol nafshecha, uvechol meodecha. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might. Thank you, Lord God, for your kindness, for your grace, and your goodness. And we ask that you would accompany us over the next hour as we wander together through the Israelites towards the Promised Land. Help us to believe in your promise so that we may arrive safely in this heavenly Promised Land that you have promised to us. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, well, last time we covered a lot of ground. We went through all of salvation history, giving us a big bird's eye overview of the story of salvation. And then we looked at the Exodus, or the beginning of the Exodus at least, looking at the books of Exodus and Leviticus. And if you recall, the entire Torah, or the Pentateuch, has what we call a chiastic structure, so that it goes A, B, C, B prime, and A prime. And so the book of Genesis talks about this loss of the paradise of the Garden of Eden. Exodus is the beginning of these wanderings through the wilderness, leaving the slavery of Egypt behind to form a covenant with God at Mount Sinai. The book of Leviticus that we talked about very briefly at the end of last class describes the forming of this covenant with all the various precepts of holiness for Israel. And today we kind of backtrack. So the first book we're going to look at, the book of Numbers, tells us a lot more about wanderings in the wilderness, kind of matching up, reflecting or mirroring the book of Exodus. And as we come to the book of Deuteronomy, we see the final preparations of Israel as they prepare to enter this promised land, which is a type of return to Eden, though not quite exactly the fullness of Eden. Death is still around, suffering is still around, but it's a type or a type of symbol for this return to Eden. So once again, there's a lot of material. I do not recommend that you try to take notes. I will make these PowerPoints available for you on Canvas or on the Google Drive for you to peruse after the lecture. All right, so what is the book of Numbers about? Big picture outline, 3 major sections in the book of Numbers. First, we meet the Israelites still at Mount Sinai. So they've been there since the middle of the book of Exodus. And we saw the forming of the Sinai covenant, Exodus 19 to 24, breaking of the Sinai covenant, Exodus 32, and then the renewal of the Sinai covenant, forming of the building of the tabernacle. And throughout the whole book of Leviticus, Israel is at Sinai. First 10 chapters of Numbers, Israel is still at Sinai, really preparing for their departure towards the promised land through the wilderness. Then the heart of the book of Numbers, chapters 10 to 21, we see the actual wanderings, which last for some 30 years or so, including the failure of the first generation, laws and rebellions during the 38 years, and then the failures of the second generation. So as you can imagine, things do not go too well for the Israelites. Then we come to the second generation in the plains of Moab. So the last third of the book, the Israelites are just on the edge of the promised land, preparing to enter into the land. So just as we've seen in the past lectures, the whole story of salvation is the story of God's initiative followed by human failure. And we continue to see that pattern throughout the wanderings in the wilderness. Timeline, what are we talking about? We saw last time how time tends to slow down as we enter into the book of Exodus. So we talked about 80 years, the first 80 years of Moses at the very beginning, and then a quick journey of 50 days to Sinai. At Sinai, they remained something like 11 months, and this takes us from Exodus to Numbers 10. And then about a 3-month journey to Kadesh, and then we have 38 and a half years of wanderings until they arrive at the plains of Moab. So from Numbers 22 until the end of Deuteronomy, we're talking about 2.5 to 3 months. So not a very long time as they dwell here in the plains of Moab. Okay, so just a quick overview. We're not going to be able to talk about everything that is in those slides. The slides cover pretty much everything in those 2 books of Numbers and Deuteronomy. So we'll pick out some highlights and mention a few of the most important points of the Exodus. So this first generation has to undergo a census. That's why the poor book of Numbers has a bad reputation as being a boring book, because you open the book and you start reading about these long lists of names and tribes and so on. But actually the book of Numbers has a lot of exciting stuff happening into it, just not in the first few chapters. So arrangement of the camp, census, role of the Levites, and then we see the setting apart of the people with some regulations and preparations. So those first 10 chapters are a little bit static, but they tell us a lot about how God wants his people to prepare themselves before they set out on these journeys. And by the way, in the next lecture, we're going to backtrack through the Exodus and see how the Exodus applies to our own lives, how the Exodus is really a prefiguration of the Christian life. And so some of these points we will return to in our next lecture. The census of the first generation. Well, we see a long count of all the various tribes, including first excluding the Levites, and then there's a special count just for the Levites, who are the priestly clan or the priestly tribe in Israel. And this is, you get a picture of a very organized people at the beginning of this book of Numbers, all divinely ordained. God wants his people to be really well organized and prepared for this journey. And so it makes for a bit of a tedious reading, but when you think about it, this is actually very important. So those first few chapters, you really see the long list of the 12 tribes surrounding the camp. You have the tabernacle, God's presence in the very middle, surrounded by the tribe of Levites. Here we see the 3 families of Levites and Moses and Aaron. So what does this say? Is that during these wanderings, God really wants to be at the center of his people, dwelling in the midst of his people with the worship of the tabernacle, constantly surrounded by his people. As we can see in all these illustrations, you can really see the presence of God and the fire going up from the Holy of Holies, really representing the actual presence of God among his people. So chapters 3 and 4, I believe, yes, is a continuation of the census, now of the Levites, who, as we said, are the priestly tribe. And so these Levites have replaced basically these Israelite firstborn. Because of the sin of the golden calf that we saw last time, we saw something happen that broke the covenant in Israel. And so because the Levites stood on the side of Moses, they become the active tribe who become the priestly tribe, and they're going to mediate between Israel and God. So we see in these first chapters some holiness regulations. Chapter 5, the purity of the camp. Lepers and the unclean are put outside of the camp. What to do in case of treachery. We have this law of jealousy. We have the consecration of certain consecrated people whom we call the Nazarites, who are going to take special vows to consecrate themselves to the Lord. And then we have the famous blessing of Aaron, through which Aaron and his sons will bless the entire people of Israel. And so you're probably familiar with it. It goes something like this. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So what is God doing through these chapters? Really preparing his people, separating the clean from the unclean, and preparing them for their journey, saying, hey, you guys really need to be prepared. You need to be in my presence. I will be with you, and I will lead you to this land flowing with milk and honey. So to this follows the dedication of the tabernacle. So you have a lot of ritual prescriptions. The tribal leaders offer many sacrifices to God. They have a celebration of the Passover. This is interesting because this kind of makes for a bookmark or a bookend. Remember how the Exodus began? Began with the Passover in Egypt, Exodus 12, and now we have the end of the time at Sinai with the another Passover 1 year later that basically closes Israel's time at Sinai before they set out. And we meet again this cloud of the presence of God that is going to guide the Israelites, and they get the start signal with the blowing of these silver trumpets in chapter 10, basically saying, this is the sign for any kind of alarm when we need to go to war, when we need to mark special feasts. So these trumpets are going to mark these solemn times. So we have a very strong focus on liturgy here in those first 10 chapters of the book of Numbers. So preparation is important before they set out on the journey, to be very close to God, very aware and obedient of his Torah and commandments. And so they are ready to go by the time we get to the middle of chapter 10. So chapter 10, verse 11 is the start signal. And if we look at now, if we zoom in a little bit on the outline of the middle of the book of Numbers, we're going to see the failure of the first generation. Probably the most famous incident in the book of Numbers is the incident of the unbelief at Kadesh Barnea when they send the spies to the promised land. And then we have 38 years that seem to pass by very quickly. And then we see the failures of the second generation in chapters 20 and 21. So they don't waste any time. We see some grumbling very soon after they begin. And here we see our start signal, as I said, in Numbers 10, verses 11 to 13. And so in this second year, after they arrived at Sinai, the cloud was taken up from above the tabernacle of the testimony. And the children of Israel set out from the wilderness of Sinai on their journeys, always led by the clouds. So they take off. They begin by complaining. This does not end well. Fire comes down from the Lord. And then we have the famous incident where they crave for meat, and they have already been eating manna for a year or so, since Exodus 16, I believe. And so they complain about the manna, and this is the opportunity for God to tell Moses, well, appoint 70 elders who will help you to rule the people. And then he says, oh, you guys want meat? I'm going to give you meat until you have more than enough of it. And so he sends them the quail, and that's going to provide for them for a while. You know, they're going to get more than enough until the meat is rotting among them. And we see the presence of God's Spirit among the elders of Israel, and the quail is sent, and this ends with a plague. So beginning of these wanderings begin in a way that's a bit rough already. We see the people of Israel complaining, and this is going to lead to this establishment of a new structure of authority with the 70 elders. So as I said, the most famous incident in the book of Numbers is this episode of Kadesh Barnea, when Moses sends these 12 spies to Canaan, where they go to the land and come back saying, this land is truly a land that flows with milk and honey, but the people who dwell in the land are strong. The cities are fortified and very large. And the descendants of Anak live there, who are these terrifying people, giant-like people. So only two are encouraged, Caleb and Joshua, who want to go and possess the land, but the rest refuse. And here we have the infamous request to go back to Egypt in the midst of this unbelief and rebellion. So what do we see here? We see yet again human failure, human unbelief that follows God's promise of a great inheritance. We really hear a reflection also of the golden calf, right? Just like the generation at Sinai rebelled and asked Aaron to make these gods that took us out of Egypt instead of the God of Israel. Here we see another very similar rebellion that is followed again by Moses' intercession. Once again, Moses' role as leader. Moses comes and saves the day, which is going to lead to divine pardon, but also judgment. And here, what is the judgment? What is the punishment? The people are condemned to wander 40 years and to die in the wilderness. So the whole first generation will die in the wilderness. And sure enough, they changed their mind and said, oh, well, no, actually, let's go and conquer the promised land right now. We're not that interested in 40 years in the wilderness. But at this point, God has spoken. And so they try to move towards the promised land, but are defeated and have to withdraw and go back into the desert. So what can we learn from this? Here is their itinerary. So you can see here Kadesh Barnea, where this incident happened, and the spies went up to Canaan. It really not that far, a question of just a few days' journey. So they really must have gotten lost for them to find, to need 40 years to get back on track. And we know they're going to go around in the wilderness here, cross the river, and actually go on this side of the Dead Sea and enter the promised land from the Jordan River. So what lesson is there for us to learn? Well, sometimes our journey is not that long to God, but we make it to be a little longer than it needs to be because of our unbelief, because of our lack of trust in God's promises. And so we see that this journey in the wilderness will not be a waste of time for Israel, even though it's going to take these 38 and a half years through the desert, the wilderness. But we're going to see God really use this time to shape their character, to teach them obedience, to teach them faithfulness, and to teach them to trust in God. And that's going to take a while. So as the saying goes, it took one day to take Israel out of Egypt, but 40 years to take Egypt out of Israel. And isn't that the case for us as well? That the Lord may lead us to faith on one day, coming to faith and being baptized, crossing our own Red Sea by going through the waters of baptism. But it takes us a lifetime to learn trust, obedience, faith, hope, and love. So there's much to learn from the Exodus in our own spiritual life. Okay, so we have some episodes of legislation in chapter 15. So some laws that are scattered throughout the book of Numbers, including the famous law of the tassels. In Hebrew, it's called tzitzit, and perhaps you have seen Jews before who wear this prayer shawl, and you can see these strings. Sometimes the prayer shawl is under their shirt, and you can only see the strings coming out of the top of their pants, basically. And what is the deal with these tassels? Well, this is to remind them of the commandments. So as they feel these strings coming basically off their shirt or off this prayer shawl, they remember the commandments and God's promise of blessing them through these commandments. And so pious Jews still wear these tassels or tzitzit. And by the way, you remember the episode when the woman touched the hem of Jesus' garment in the gospel. More than likely, we're talking about these tassels that reminded every Jew of the commandments. So in chapter 16, we see another rebellion, an anti-clerical rebellion. So this guy called Korach and 250 men rise up against Moses and Aaron, and they're saying, who do you think you are, you privileged Moses and Aaron? We're all holy, we're all priests here. Why do you guys think you're better than we are? And of course, Moses and Aaron do not think they're better than the rest of the people, but there is a difference between God, who has ordained Aaron and his sons to be priests, and now Korah, who is only a Levite, comes and wants to usurp this role. So again, they speak of Egypt as a land flowing with milk and honey, as if this were the promised land. And this does not end well for Korah and his men. So the ground opens up and swallows them with fire, consuming the 250. Do not follow in Korah's footsteps. The book of Numbers is full of crises, and in the midst of this, we still continue to see God working among his people. All right, let's move on to the second generation, from Kadesh to Mount Hor. What is really interesting about the book of Numbers is that for sure this is when the 38 years go by, those famous 40 years in the wilderness. Well, one was at Mount Sinai, and then about 6 months kind of near the end in the plains of Moab. But we never really notice, okay, this was, year 5 and year 6 and year 7. We're just told at some point, whoa, this is like 38 years later. So it kind of creeps up on you without noticing. And so by the time we get to chapter 20, this is really a generation later. We have another episode of the water from the rock, also mirroring a similar incident in the book of Exodus. And this leads us to the death of Aaron. So the great first high priest dies there on Mount Hor, and then Eleazar, his son, will be his successor. So we talked about last time how there was a succession of priests from father to son, and this is going to continue basically throughout most of Israel's history in the Bible. So from Mount Hor, they come to a victory over the Canaanites, a first victory in chapter 21. And then you did have to read this passage about the fiery serpents. A bit of a strange passage when, again, unbelief on the part of the Israelites leads to the Lord sending all these snakes who bite them, and many of them died. And God commands Moses to build this bronze serpent that they are to look at. And by looking at this serpent, they are miraculously healed from these serpent bites. And we know that the Gospel of John will refer to this elevating of the serpent in the wilderness. So John 3:14-15, just before the famous John 3:16, says, "As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life." So a great example of a use of type or typological theology here in the Gospel of John, taking this sign of the serpent in the Old Testament, in the Torah, and using that as a sign pointing to Christ. So they journey to Moab. They have more victories against Sihon, the king of the Amorites, and Og, the king of Bashan. So you'll often hear about these two kings in the Psalms, for example, that rejoice over the first Israelite victories in the wilderness as they approach the promised land. And we come to the third part of the book of Numbers. Now the second generation is in the plains of Moab, so they're going to be parked there for the rest of the book. Facing threats from Moab, another census, and then final preparations for their possession of the land. So probably the most fun and kind of unusual, a bit of a strange story in this third part of the book of Numbers is the episode of Balak and Balaam, or Bilam in Hebrew, Balaam sometimes he's called. So a very strange incident, isn't it? They arrive in the plains of Moab. So this is right across from the Jordan River. They're very close to the promised land. So this king of the Moabites, Balak, calls this prophet Balaam to curse Israel. And we have the famous incident of the talking donkey here when Balaam is on his way and an angel of the Lord stops him. The donkey sees the angel, but he doesn't see it. And he starts talking to the donkey, and sure enough, the donkey talks back. And so a very amusing dialogue here in chapter 22, which really points to this incident of the attempted curse of Israel, because this is what Balak wants to do. He wants this prophet of Moab to curse the people of Israel. And that, of course, would be in opposition to the promises that God made to Abraham. God said, "Surely I will bless you, I will bless your seed, and all the families of the earth will be blessed through your descendants." And so there's some kind of supernatural intervention here that the Spirit of God moves Balaam to not curse but bless Israel. And here we see this echo of the book of Genesis. "How lovely are your tents, O Jacob, your dwellings, O Israel. Blessed is he who blesses you, and cursed is he who curses you." And so we really see the hand of God on this little people, the people of Israel. And many say it's by no coincidence that we still see the people of Israel today, the longest surviving people, the Jewish people, who in fact have returned to their land, have returned to the land of Israel in the last 70 years or so. And so this is really quite extraordinary to see that these promises made in the Pentateuch, in the Torah, apparently still hold today as we continue to see God's faithfulness among his people. So this happens 4 times that Balaam tries to curse Israel, but he apparently is unable to do so, and he keeps blessing them instead. The famous blessing we find in Numbers 24, when Balaam says, "I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob. A scepter shall rise out of Israel. Out of Jacob one shall have dominion and destroy the remains of the city." And so even ancient Jewish interpreters have interpreted this prophecy as a prophecy of the Messiah the future Redeemer, the star from Jacob, who would come and redeem Israel and reign over Israel through having dominion over them. So a veiled messianic prophecy in this prophecy of a pagan prophet, Balaam. But what Balak and Balaam are unable to do, the Israelites do themselves. So nobody manages to shoot themselves in the foot as Israel during the wilderness wanderings. So they arrive at this place called Shittim or Baal Peor, and they turn to sexual immorality, harlotry, and idolatry, which unleashes a plague, and again, the wrath of the Lord turns against them. So that one priest called Phinehas slays one of the idolaters and stops the plague after 24,000 Israelites die. And so Phinehas is going to receive this covenant of an everlasting priesthood. So the Aaronic priesthood now will be narrowed to the family and generations of this priest who intervened and stopped the plague. So once again, we see another echo of the golden calf here with this harlotry and idolatry happening at Baal Peor. That is just about going to lead to a complete collapse and annihilation of the people of God if it were not for the intercession of a few faithful Israelites who interceded before God. So at the end of the book of Numbers, we see now another census of the second generation of Israelites. God promises to Moses that he will show Moses the land, but Moses will not be able to enter, apparently because he lost his temper when he struck the rock twice at this second episode of the water flowing from the rock. So a successor is very important. God will appoint Joshua as successor to Moses, and Joshua will continue the leadership of the people of Israel after the death of Moses. In chapter 28 of Numbers, and 29, we see a repetition of this establishment of the various sacred times, including the Jewish festivals, how they are commanded to offer sacrifice and to remember and to commemorate God's great deeds in the history of salvation, in the history of Israel's redemption. So what does this say? This points to the importance of liturgy, of worship. What does worship do? Well, a lot of things. We worship God in the present, but we also remember God's great deeds in the past. And this is why God institutes these festivals or Jewish feasts, such as the Passover, which commemorates, of course, the Passover, the last of the 10 plagues when Israel left Egypt. The Feast of Weeks is going to commemorate not the Dean of the Honors College, though we can also add that in there, but also the giving of the Torah, the giving of the 10 Commandments, and the shaping of the covenant between God and Israel. The Feast of Trumpets is an anticipation of the final judgment, the Day of Atonement, the day when the high priest comes into the temple, and the Feast of Tabernacles, which is a commemoration of all the wanderings in the wilderness. So that's the point of these festivals or feasts, that recall God's great deeds in the past and are supposed to infuse Israel with a new faith, hope, and love as they recall God's great deeds in their feast. Okay, final preparations. Another war, this time against Midian. And now we see 2.5 tribes who ask to receive an inheritance on the eastern side of the Jordan River. So this is the division of the various tribes and the territory that they're going to have. And we're also given the stops in Israel's journey, as well as instructions to drive out the Canaanites when they arrive. So we'll talk a little more about this when we get to Deuteronomy. So where did Israel travel through this time? We're not really sure. I mentioned that last time when we looked at the Exodus. The traditional location of Mount Sinai is over here in the south of the Sinai Peninsula. Others are not so sure. Some have speculated that it might even be here on this side, which is today's Saudi Arabia. There's Kadesh Barnea, and so they certainly went around in circles for a long time, eventually making their way over here to the eastern side of the Jordan River and of the Dead Sea, right here, close to Heshbon and just across the river from Jericho. So that's where we are for the end of this book of Numbers. All right, so we end with the delimitation of the borders of the land. We're told which tribal leaders are going to be in charge. God appoints Levitical cities because the Levites will not own any land, as well as cities of refuge where Israelites guilty of unintentional killing are going to be able to find refuge in these 6 cities. So that's your bird's eye view of the book of Numbers. Very quick overview to let us know what's going on, how God is leading his people, and how God continues to extend his grace and his mercy, even in the midst of judgment and even in the midst of failure on the part of the Israelites. Okay, so we now come to the book of Deuteronomy, where the whole book, Israel is now in the plains of Moab. So another book that very sadly gets a bad rap because there's not a whole lot of movement. In fact, this book consists mostly of speeches. So Moses giving 3 long speeches to Israel and giving them a lot of final exhortations before they enter the land. So Deuteronomy in Hebrew, the word is Sefer Dvarim, the book of words, literally. And indeed, there are many words in this book. Where do we get Deuteronomy? From the Greek name Deuteronomium, which means second or repeated law. And indeed, we find that all these new instructions that Moses gives to Israel are kind of distinct from the Sinai covenant. They don't replace the Sinai covenant, but they certainly build upon it. So 3 long speeches, and some have called this book the last will or the last testament of Moses before he dies. So Deuteronomy will become the covenant, rule, and national constitution of Israel. And something very odd about the book of Deuteronomy is that someone is mostly silent. God is silent in this book, so that it is now Moses who largely speaks on God's behalf. Why is Deuteronomy important? Because it's been called the linchpin of the Old Testament. So it's basically your hinge between your first 4 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. So the hinge between the Pentateuch and historical books. Deuteronomy is really giving Israel this national constitution, which is going to be their standard by which they are judged, whether they are righteous or unrighteous in historical books. It's also one of the most frequently cited Old Testament books in the New Testament. Fun fact. So here's our setting. They're over here in the plains of Moab, and it looks like this. It's actually a pretty high elevation. And today, the plains of Moab are in the country of Jordan, where I've personally never been, but I was on the other side in Israel, and there's your Dead Sea. And so you have these plains over here, just below all these hills, these elevations of these mountains of Moab. So what is Deuteronomy interested in? Well, covenant and Torah for sure. We see this crystallization of all these laws that God has been given to Israel. God is going to command Israel to worship him in a central sanctuary. So that is an essential part of Deuteronomy. The promise of the land is reaffirmed. Now Israel is going to be contemplating their past history, the history of the Exodus, and they're going to start shaping theology out of God's great deeds, really since the book of Genesis, but especially the Exodus since the time of the coming out of Egypt. The retribution principle is really laid out in this book. What do we mean by retribution principle? Well, God makes a covenant with his people. Follow the commandments and God will bless you. Disobey the commandments and this will draw curses upon you. And we see Deuteronomy making this very clear and laying out this principle for Israel very strongly, especially near the end of the book. Like, my people, I want to bless you, but you have to remain faithful to me so that I can release my blessings upon you. The book of Deuteronomy also prepares Israel for 2 new situations. First, life without Moses. The Israelites have never experienced anything else than being under the leadership of Moses, but Moses will soon die. And it's also preparing them for these difficult wars of conquest as they prepare to conquer the promised land. So the book of Deuteronomy reveals also new conditions for Israel that we see change a little bit compared to what we saw in the book of Exodus. So this is going to involve legal concessions, ritual stipulations, and blessings and curses. So let's look briefly at each one of those three new conditions. So first, we see surprisingly a number of moral compromises and legal concessions in the book of Deuteronomy. Most notably, this includes genocidal warfare against the Canaanites. So we know this is probably the biggest moral, ethical problem in the entire Old Testament. In fact, in the entire Bible, the fact that God commands the Israelites to go and basically kill off the Canaanites. So I could say a lot about this. Just a couple of points to see if we can make sense of this. I mean, how could our God, whom we believe is good, could command such a thing? Well, for one thing, if you read in Genesis 15, when God gives this promise to Abraham, saying your people will be slaves in a foreign land and eventually will return to this land that I'm promising to you, and they will return after 400 years because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. The iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So you can see in the book of Genesis that it already anticipates that the Canaanites will be thoroughly wicked people. And in other words, the Canaanites reap what they sow. In other words, we see that every wicked nation at some point is going to be judged by God. We see that in the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. And we see that Abraham was able to negotiate with God, so to speak, that God would spare Sodom and Gomorrah if he would only find 10 righteous men in it. And God ended up destroying Sodom and Gomorrah. So apparently he could not even find 10 righteous people in it, though he did take out Lot and his family. So we see these people were thoroughly wicked and quite violent in the ancient Near East. The other major point is that God is the one ultimately who gives life and takes away life. And even though we can be glad that this is no longer his strategy to send people to war against one another, we can see that God very often works within a certain culture. And so in the ancient Old Testament times, we're dealing with some very violent cultures back at the time. And so we see God who is really, in a certain way, we see a certain pedagogy, right, from the time of the Old Testament to the New Testament. And so the Sermon on the Mount was not yet given. We did not yet have the law of the gospel at this time. And so basically, it is a very difficult moral problem, but we see that ultimately God is the master of life and death. We see also that the Israelites are allowed to take foreign slave wives, which is not exactly modern morality or Christian morality. And they're also allowed to divorce and remarry, which we see Jesus addressing this one quite explicitly. And he says that Moses allowed this because of the hardness of your heart. We see the prophet Ezekiel, who also speaks of God giving them, I gave them statutes that were not good and ordinances by which they could not have life. So the prophet Ezekiel hints at that the book of Deuteronomy reflects certain moral compromises in the laws that God gives to Israel. Okay, we also have ritual stipulations. So firstlings must be sacrificed from herds and flocks at this central sanctuary. And the idea was that once you get into the land, Israel, I don't want you guys to set up your little private places of worship everywhere. You all have to send to worship me in the central sanctuary, which is going to be in Jerusalem. So a way of centralizing the worship here, which will become the temple later. Also, as I mentioned, this enacts the law of retribution. And so we see Moses who seals the covenant with blessings and curses. So that faithfulness will bring blessing, peace, and prosperity, whereas sin and unfaithfulness will bring curses, including disease, defeat, famine, destruction, and exile. So we will see that when we get to Deuteronomy 28. So those are the three major changes that we see in the book of Deuteronomy. What kind of a structure does the book have? Well, Deuteronomy is really a covenant book. So what it does, first it looks backward at the history of Israel, and then it's going to give us a summary of the covenant that God is making with Israel. Then the core of the book, God will give covenant stipulations, in other words, commandments to Israel. And many of them will repeat and expand upon the 10 commandments and the commandments that we've seen in the book of Exodus, that we will find in the book of Leviticus. Then we see this inner frame where we have a covenant ceremony, and then an outer frame of a look forward. So we begin by looking at the past, we end by looking at the future. And at the heart of the book are all of these stipulations that are going to really manifest how Israel is God's chosen people, living in the holiness that God is calling them to live. Deuteronomy is also shaped in the shape of a covenant treaty format. So this is very similar to ancient covenants in the ancient Near East, where these covenants began with stating who's going to be the mediator of this covenant. Then you're going to have a history of the relationship. Remember, what we're talking about, a covenant means an agreement between two parties, right? So in the ancient Near East, you had, for example, two nations that made a covenant with one another to protect one another, or to have this alliance between one another. So what happens when God makes this covenant with Israel? We're going to need a covenant mediator. We're going to need to talk and remember about the history of the two parties, so the history of God and Israel. Then we're going to see these stipulations, the conditions through which the covenant will be enacted. So here's my part of the deal, here's your part of the deal, and we have to keep it. If we break it, then the covenant is going to be broken and bad things will happen. So this is what we see in these commandments, these so-called great commandments to love and worship God alone, and then ancillary commandments. Then we're going to see covenant ratification. So chapters 27 to 30, basically the solemn forming and closing of the covenant through ceremony, through the solemn pronouncing of blessings and curses, and with an oath that we will remain faithful to this covenant. Finally, we see dynastic disposition, which is going to ensure covenant continuity. So we have to have a public deposition of the document and then calling up witnesses to witness upon this covenant. So Deuteronomy really follows this format of ancient covenant treaties between different parties, except that here the parties are God himself and Israel. So what's our outline of the book? As we said, this book consists of speeches. So the first speech is mostly this look backwards, this look back at the history of God and Israel, with some stipulations. The second speech is the heart of the book because it includes a repetition of the Decalogue, or 10 Commandments, and its stipulations, along with the sanctions, blessings, and curses. The third speech, a so-called new covenant, that I will say a little more about in a few minutes, and then future blessings and a call to decision. Then we have 3 or 4 chapters of last acts where we have the transfer of authority to Joshua and the death of Moses. So what can we say about this first speech, first 4 chapters of Deuteronomy? Well, we see, as we said, a historical prologue and a narration, a recapitulation of God's past dealings with Israel. From Sinai to Kadesh, we see the episode of the spies and the 38 years with the conquest of these initial kingdoms of Sichon and Og. And we're going to see really a review of how God was faithful to his people, but it's also a bit of a critique against Israel, saying, well, I kept my part of the deal, but you didn't, Israel. And so through this prologue, we're kind of establishing that there's already a relationship between God and his people. So that's kind of your overview, historical overview of these first 3 chapters. So this follows an exhortation to observe the law faithfully. Now, Moses is going to expound on the law in the next few chapters. So he's saying, listen, guys, you have to hear and obey this law because God showed up at Mount Horeb, at Mount Sinai. You remember this? God showed up and said that he would take you to this land of promise, this land flowing with milk and honey. Therefore, no idolatry, because you know that idolatry will lead to exile and to destruction. So the Lord is unique, and only the Lord you should worship. So all this first speech really sets the stage with this historical prologue and this exhortation to really pay attention to the commandments that God is going to give you, or rather that Moses is going to give you on behalf of God. Now the second speech, as we said, is the heart of the book. We have an introduction followed by the Decalogue, right? So the 10 Commandments, which are the heart of the covenant, the heart of the Torah. And the Decalogue appeared first in Exodus 20, and now in Deuteronomy 5, we see this repetition of the Decalogue, followed by the people's response. And now what is very interesting about the heart of Deuteronomy, that even most scholars often don't even mention in commentaries, is that we see the rest of these chapters, up to chapter 26, are really a commentary on the 10 Commandments. So they really expand on what God gives. He gives the general stipulations of the 10 Commandments, and then he's going to explain, well, how are you supposed to keep these 10 Commandments? So the first one, of course, we know is, I am the Lord your God, who took you out of Egypt. You shall have no other gods than me. So how are you supposed to observe this first commandment? Well, we're going to have about 6 chapters of explanations on how you're supposed to keep the commandments. And this includes the Shema that we prayed at the beginning of this lecture. So hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. This is one way of expressing this very first commandment given to Israel. Also in this section, chapter 6, you hear of the tefillin and mezuzah. What in the world is that, you ask? Well, the tefillin is what you see here. These Orthodox Jews wrap these straps around their arms, and you see this box. Here are the straps around their arms and this box on their foreheads. This would be a tefillin, or phylacteries are called in Hebrew. And so this is a way also of remembering, of reminding every faithful Jew of God's commandments. What is a mezuzah? It's another little box like this that you put on doorposts with a little scroll with, I believe the Shema is in there, so you'll have some of the commandments, and every time a Jew walks into a home, they kiss the mezuzah as a way of remembering the commandments of God. Why is it important for you to know this? What does a tefillin look like? So you don't get confused and call for bomb scares in airplanes, because this actually has happened about 10 years ago, when a Jewish teen who put on tefillin in a plane set off a bomb scare that diverted a plane from LaGuardia Airport. So there's the kid with his grandma, and so he put on tefillin and he alarmed the flight attendants so that they actually diverted the flight. So the lesson to learn is this. So don't confuse this, a kid putting on tefillin, with this kind of equipment. All right, back to Deuteronomy. So tefillin and mezuzah. So now, still commenting on the first commandment, you have to separate yourself from these Canaanite nations and their gods. Don't forget the Lord. Remember the golden calf. Remember the past, the new tablets, the Ark of the Covenant, the Levites. Remember to love and fear the Lord. Keep those commandments to live in the land. All of this is basically an exhortation to keep the first commandment. Then when we get to chapter 12, I won't go into every one of them, but you can have a look at this on your own. You can see that here are the 10 commandments. And then if you walk through chapters 12 to 26, you can see, well, don't make a carved image. This means destroying Canaanite altars, food regulations, and so on. So don't engage in this pagan worship. Don't take the name of the Lord in vain. Who takes the name of the Lord in vain? For example, false prophets or occult practices. Observe the Sabbath. Now we have a listing of all the various feasts, such as Passover, Tabernacles, and so on. Honor father and mother involves respecting all forms of authority, judges, officers, law of the king, priests, Levites, and so on. You shall not commit murder. Here we have instructions on the cities of refuge, on how to deal with unsolved murders, and so on. You shall not commit adultery. We see more laws of sexual immorality here. You shall not steal. Don't eat your neighbor's crops. You shall not give false testimony, and you shall not covet. So basically, without going into the details, you can see that Deuteronomy 6 to 26 basically follow the Ten Commandments and expand on those. So pay attention to those as you look at those texts in colloquy. All right, so Moses concludes his second speech by giving Israel covenant sanctions, and we see them preparing to utter blessings and curses that they will say when they enter into the land of Canaan. And the main chapter of the blessings and curses in chapter 28. So this is kind of a daunting chapter to read. You have only 14 verses of blessings, but then this long list of curses that will follow disobedience. So apparently when you have the carrot and the stick often works as a more powerful motivation. And you can see that in the book of Deuteronomy, that God says, I really, really, really want you guys to remain faithful to my covenant. And so you will be blessed if you do, but if you don't, woe to you. There really will be consequences. So this connects to last time when I said the law of the covenant is kind of like the law of gravity, right? If you decide to violate the law of gravity, you won't do anything to the law of gravity, but you will hurt yourself. And that's the lesson that is passed on to Israel here. And of course, the ultimate curse would be exile. The Lord will scatter you from among the peoples, from one end of the earth to the other. Okay, so real quick, the third speech. Moses speaks of the Deuteronomic covenants as a type of new covenant. And you thought that Jesus instituted the new covenant. But no, this is a covenant that is distinct from the covenant made at Sinai. And once again, there's a lot of exhortations to keep this covenant with, again, the promise of future blessings. And what is beautiful, one of my favorite parts in Deuteronomy is in chapter 30, where Moses says to the people, listen, this covenant is not up in heaven. Those commandments are not up in heaven. They're right here given to you. And it's possible to observe those commandments. And he says, I set before you, I will read it to you in the very next slide, this possibility of being blessed. And so choose life and do follow these commandments. Sometimes we as Christians, we tend to see the Torah as something that is impossible and something that we're kind of relieved that Christ released us from. But we know that for Israel, the commandments are a source of joy and they are a source of life. And so here's the great exhortation in Deuteronomy 30. When all these things have happened to you, the blessings and the curse that I have set before you, if you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and return to the Lord your God, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you, gathering you again from all the peoples among whom the Lord your God has scattered you. Even if you are exiled to the ends of the world, from there the Lord your God will gather you, and from there he will bring you back. The Lord your God will bring you into the land that your ancestors possessed, and you will possess it. He will make you more prosperous and numerous than your ancestors. So beautiful promise, not just of exile. I mean, that's not so beautiful. This warning of exile is actually a prophecy of exile. In other words, God knows that Israel will be unfaithful to the covenant and he will scatter them across the nations. But even though they will remain unfaithful, God promises that he will return them back to the land that he promised to their forefathers. So in the midst of Deuteronomy, you have this incredible prophecy of exile and return. And then Deuteronomy 30, verse 6, God promises that he will circumcise your heart and the heart of your descendants so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, in order that you may live. So previously, Moses had commanded Israel to circumcise your heart, but now God promises that he will do it. So the circumcision of your heart comes from your will and your desires to do it, but also it comes from the power of God who will enable that. And we see this is repeated in the book of Ezekiel when God promises also a new heart and a new spirit and a heart of flesh. So there's the great exhortation of Deuteronomy. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying him, and holding fast to him. For that means life to you in length of days, so that you may live in the land that the Lord swore to give you to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. So the commandments of the Lord are life-giving. And so we really hear Moses exhorting, pleading to Israel, please choose life, because life is a blessing and life is what we were made for. We were not made for death and for curse, but we must remain in the covenant in order to experience the fullness of these blessings. So Deuteronomy closes with this transferal of authority. Joshua is going to be the new leader. He is commissioned. We see the writing of songs, including the famous Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32. And we know that the end is now near for Moses, and Moses is given this last privilege of being able to see the land of Canaan that the Israelites will be conquering in the next book of the Bible, in the book of Joshua. And the book ends with Moses' death after he blesses the tribes and transfers his authority to Joshua. So here's our survey of Numbers and Deuteronomy. It gives you a bit of a roadmap, and so hopefully it sets the stage for your discussions of select passages from the book of Deuteronomy. So have a great colloquy discussion, and remember to choose life. Bye, and God bless.